It was a bright morning in Charleston, South Carolina. Sunlight spilled like syrup over the manicured lawns, the air ripe with the scent of magnolias and fresh-cut grass. On any other day, the calm suburban hum would have gone unnoticed. But today, it would become the setting for a twisted story of love, loss, and blood. Detective Ruth Delgado sipped her black coffee, eyes half focused on the local paper's crossword, when the call came in. 911 received a report of a body found in a home on Hollow Pine Drive. The voice crackled through the dispatch radio. Possible homicide. Responding unit requested. Ruth dropped the mug onto the table, snatched her badge, and was out the door. The victim's name was Valerie Carter, 38, a former fashion blogger turned boutique owner. Known in town for her style and sharp wit, she was the type who always drew attention, even in grocery store lines. Her body had been found by her husband, Ethan Miller, who was now sitting pale and shaking on the front steps of their colonial-style home. "She didn't deserve this," he kept repeating, clutching his knees. Inside the house, things were oddly pristine. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. Valerie had been shot once in the chest, slumped over the couch with a half glass of white wine on the coffee table. A paused movie on the flat screen showed two actors frozen mid-laugh, an ironic backdrop to a gruesome scene. Ruth stepped into the room and let her eyes sweep over every detail. She was known for her patience, and she liked to let the scene tell its story. "Any signs of robbery?" she asked the uniformed officer on scene. "None. Jewelry box untouched. Wallet still here. Even her phone's on the charger." Ruth crouched by the body. "This was personal," she said under her breath. She knew the shooter. Back at the precinct, Ruth started her background checks. Valerie had no known enemies, a clean financial record, and a glowing reputation online. Ethan Miller, her husband, had been a high school English teacher until 2 years ago, when he inherited a small fortune from his late mother and retired early. No priors, no known issues, except one. According to medical insurance records, Ethan had undergone a number of discrete treatments for erectile dysfunction starting 3 years ago, unsuccessfully. It was rare to find such personal information that tied so neatly to a motive, but Ruth wasn't the kind to jump to conclusions. Still, a little bell rang in the back of her mind. She dug deeper. Before Valerie, Ethan had been married to another woman, April Simmons. They had been married for nearly 8 years before separating 5 years ago. The divorce paperwork cited irreconcilable differences, but that was often a placeholder. April had moved out of state afterward, disappearing off the radar. But 2 years ago, she'd moved back to Charleston. And just 6 months before Valerie's murder, April and Valerie had stopped being friends. Ruth visited Valerie's boutique downtown. The shop was closed, a single rose left outside with a handwritten note that read, "You were always the light in the room." Ruth pushed open the glass door and was greeted by Valerie's assistant, a tall young woman named Lacey. She didn't have enemies, Lacey said, but she was tense lately, like she knew something was coming. "Was it something personal? Work-related?" Lacey looked hesitant. Well, she was mad at her friend, April Simmons. They'd been best friends for years, practically sisters. But then something happened. What? She found out April had reconnected with Ethan. Her ex-husband Ruth's pen stopped. "Valerie's current husband?" "Yeah." Valerie said April was seeing him behind her back. They hadn't spoken in months. The perfect wife, the perfect friend, the perfect life. Ruth had seen that mask before. It always cracked before the end. By that afternoon, Ruth had pulled April's address, a quiet rental on the east side. The front yard was unkempt, weeds bursting through the walkway. April opened the door looking surprised but not scared. "Yes," she asked. "I'm Detective Ruth Delgado. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Valerie Carter." April blinked. "Is she okay?" "She was found murdered this morning." The blood drained from April's face. Her knees buckled slightly and Ruth had to steady her. She invited the detective in, hands shaking as she poured a glass of water for herself. "We were friends," she said. "Best friends, until she found out I was seeing Ethan again." "How long had you been seeing him?" April bit her lip. "It started as a mistake, a few dinners. We'd been through a lot together. Then it turned into something more." Did Valerie threaten you? She told me to stay away, said I'd regret it if I didn't. Ruth tilted her head. Did you kill her? April flinched. What? No, I would never. I loved her, even if we weren't speaking. Ruth didn't reply. She stood and thanked April, leaving the house with a growing certainty. April was hiding something, but it wasn't just guilt. There was fear there, deep, simmering fear. That night, Ruth sat at her desk replaying the crime scene photos. One detail stuck with her, the angle of the shot. It came from above, angled downward. The shooter had been standing while Valerie sat. No sign of struggle, no sign she saw it coming. A lover's quarrel, a friend's betrayal, or both. She scanned through traffic cam footage around Hollow Pine Drive the night before the murder. One camera picked up a sedan pulling into the driveway at 8:14 p.m. Ruth froze the frame. The driver stepping out wasn't Valerie. It was April Simmons. Detective Ruth Delgado leaned back in her worn leather chair, staring at the paused traffic cam footage. April Simmons, hands in her coat pockets, face mostly hidden beneath a scarf, had parked in Valerie Carter's driveway the night of the murder. The timestamp read 8:14 p.m. Valerie had been declared dead at approximately 8:45 p.m. That left a tight 30-minute window. April had claimed she hadn't spoken to Valerie in months. Lie number one, Ruth muttered, jotting it down in her notebook. She knew better than to confront someone without more than a timestamp. She needed motive. She needed proof. The next morning, Ruth returned to the precinct and pulled April's phone records. It didn't take long to find something interesting. 3 calls to Ethan Miller's number in the hours following the time of death. The first at 9:02 p.m., the second at 9:11 p.m., and the third at 9:25 p.m. None answered. Next, she requested Ethan's phone records. Ruth's fingers drummed as she waited. Her gut was coiling now, not just with suspicion, but a growing sense of complexity. She didn't believe in clean-cut murders. People were messy, emotions even messier. And this was rage. Ethan returned to the station later that afternoon at Ruth's request. He looked tired, like sleep hadn't dared visit him the night before. I just want to help however I can, he said, eyes hollow. We were supposed to go to bed early. I was in the guest room. Valerie had been upset all day, kept saying she needed space. Space because of April? His gaze flicked up. How did you? She told me. You were having an affair. Ethan's lips parted, then closed. A full 5 seconds passed before he replied. It wasn't like that. April and we were close once. When my marriage with Valerie fell apart, I guess I went back to what felt familiar. But I didn't mean to hurt anyone. You lied to your wife. She left me emotionally long before I lied, he said, bitterness thick in his voice. She resented me. When the treatments didn't work, when I stopped being enough, she turned cold. Everything after that was just survival. So you were seeing April again? He exhaled slowly. Yes. And you were planning to leave Valerie? He didn't answer. Back at her desk, Ruth reviewed Valerie's old emails and messages, which had been pulled from her cloud account. In the months leading up to her death, Valerie had exchanged a flurry of increasingly angry emails with an account labeled simply A Simmons, March 3rd, 9:14 p.m. I trusted you with everything. You think he'll love you more because you're still intact? He's broken April, just like our friendship is now. March 5th, 11:02 a.m. Stay away from him. From me. Don't test what I'm capable of. Ruth leaned back, tension gathering in her shoulders. The email tone wasn't desperation, it was possession. Valerie had loved Ethan, not for what he was, but for what she wanted him to be. When his body failed, her patience thinned. And when April stepped in to fill the void, Valerie's rage turned into obsession. A week before the murder, Valerie had ordered a small revolver from a private seller, unregistered. Ruth confirmed it through a traced bank transfer to a known gun dealer who specialized in off-the-book sales. The weapon hadn't yet been found, but Ruth had a growing theory. What if the plan hadn't been to wait for death, but to cause it? Except someone else beat her to the shot. That evening, Ruth met with the coroner. Anything unusual? She asked as she reviewed the report. Dr. Pennington, a calm, methodical man with a precise memory, nodded. The wound was close range, about 2 feet, straight through the chest. Clean shot, minimal powder burns. But here's the part that got me. He held up a high-res image of Valerie's hands. No defensive wounds, no scratches, bruises, or signs of struggle. She was calm, maybe even unaware. Ruth narrowed her eyes. Someone she trusted. Exactly. With a court order in hand, Ruth returned to April's home the next day. April answered the door looking like she hadn't slept either. Her hair was tangled, her eyes red. Ruth held up the paper. We're conducting a full search of the property. Inside, the team split up. Ruth focused on the garage. Dusty boxes, an old treadmill, yard tools. Nothing that screamed killer until she saw a pair of gloves in the trash. Bin, leather, female-sized, stained faintly with something dark near the wrist. She bagged them. Get this tested. Meanwhile, another officer called her from the attic. Detective? You'll want to see this. Ruth climbed up and stepped into the musty space. On a far wall, hidden behind an old bookshelf, was a locked suitcase. They forced it open. Inside was a blood-stained blouse, a half-burned photo of Valerie and April in their 20s, and, taped to the inside of the suitcase lid, a note. It read, "He was mine first." Later that night, back at the precinct, Ruth sat across from April in the interview room. You lied to me, she said plainly. April was silent. You said you hadn't seen Valerie in months, but you were in her driveway the night she died. We have video. We have your calls to Ethan, and we found your suitcase with her blood on it. April's chin trembled. You don't understand. Help me then. She took a deep breath. She was going to kill him, Valerie. She called me that day, said she wanted to make peace, but I knew her. She didn't make peace. She made moves. So you went to stop her. I went to talk, to reason, but when I got there, she had the gun. She said she'd rather see Ethan dead than let him be happy with someone else. We fought. She turned her back. I panicked. The gun went off. Ruth leaned in. So you shot her? April looked up, teary but firm. Yes. Ruth studied her. The confession fit, but not perfectly. April might be guilty of shooting Valerie, but not everything made sense. The gloves, the suitcase hidden days later, the emotional tone. It wasn't panic, it was revenge. And Ruth had learned something in her 20 years of homicide work. Panic doesn't write messages like, he was mine first. Charleston was a city that wore its charm like a veil. Soft cobblestone streets, historic mansions, and oak trees draped in Spanish moss. But under that beauty, darkness could fester like rot in old wood. Detective Ruth Delgado knew this better than most, and now that darkness was crawling from the closets of the Miller and Simmons households. April Simmons' confession had been damning, but something in it felt too rehearsed, too convenient. Ruth had been at this long enough to know when a story made too much sense. Back at her desk, Ruth reviewed the timeline again. Valerie was last seen alive by her neighbor at 7:52 p.m., watering her rose bushes. April's car appeared on camera at 8:14 p.m. The coroner had placed Valerie's time of death around 8:45 p.m. That left a 30-minute window. But what bothered Ruth wasn't when Valerie died. It was how. April claimed they struggled over the gun, that it went off in panic. Yet Valerie had been shot cleanly through the chest. No gunpowder residue on her hands. No struggle evident on her skin or clothing. No bruises. No scrapes. No defense wounds. Ruth knew what that meant. The shot hadn't been fired during a scuffle. Valerie had been calm, maybe even seated, trusting. That wasn't panic. That was execution. Ruth requested a deeper forensic analysis on the gloves found in April's trash. The report arrived the next morning. Ruth sat up straight. That was her opening. She pulled Ethan's fingerprint file from their system. It was standard procedure to collect prints from spouses in homicide investigations. She had the lab compare the partials. 20 minutes later, the answer came back. Ethan Miller. Ruth returned to the case board, pacing in front of photos, maps, and sticky notes, like a conductor in an invisible orchestra. The players were all there, but who had written the final movement? She thought about Ethan. Charming, intelligent, always one step away from unraveling. His limp hands the morning Valerie died, his cold bitterness toward her, the resentment he wore like a cologne. April had been the spark, but Ethan might have been the flame. Later that afternoon, Ruth met again with April, this time under observation. "I need you to walk me through what happened again," she said, in full detail. April nodded, nerves twitching beneath her skin. "She called me, asked to talk. I was scared, but I went. I got there around 8. We talked. She was calm at first, then started yelling. She said I ruined her life, said Ethan was broken because of me. And then she picked up the gun, said if she couldn't have him, no one could. I tried to grab it. It went off." Ruth let the silence stretch. "You wore gloves?" "No." "Then why are Ethan's prints on a pair of women's leather gloves in your trash?" April blinked. "What?" "We found your suitcase in the attic, with her blood, a burned photo, a message. This wasn't panic, April. This was personal." April's hands began to shake. "I didn't write that note." Ruth leaned forward. "Did Ethan?" April didn't answer. Ruth knew she had to press the thread. She requested surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and ATMs near Hollow Pine Drive the night of the murder. And finally a hit. At 9:03 p.m., a camera caught Ethan at a gas station 2 miles away, face pale, hands trembling, his shirt wrinkled and stained slightly with what could have been wine or blood. He bought nothing, just stood there, stared at his car, then drove away. What was he doing? Ruth pulled the precinct phone logs. On a hunch, she checked for any calls made to April from the station phone on the night of the murder. Bingo. A call at 10:47 p.m. from Ethan's number. April had said nothing about that. That evening, Ruth drove to April's home herself. "I need the truth," she said as April opened the door. "No games, no scripts. You didn't kill her, did you?" April looked down. She was going to leave him. That night, Valerie had seen us together. She wasn't angry, she was done. She told Ethan he was a failure, that she wanted a divorce. He lost it. Ruth's breath caught. "He killed her?" April nodded slowly. "I was in the kitchen. I heard the shot. I ran in. She was already gone. Ethan was just standing there. Said she pushed him too far, that she broke something inside him that night. And the gloves? He made me put them in the trash. Said no one would believe the truth, that we had to look like the victims. And the suitcase? That was me. I panicked. I tried to burn the photo, hide the clothes. I was scared." Ruth typed up the full report over the next 2 days. She had the final evidence now, matching fingerprints on the gloves, the altered crime scene, the false confessions, and now a statement from April, under immunity, placing Ethan at the center of it all. The motive was buried in layers of shame and betrayal. Ethan's broken self-image, Valerie's rejection, April's return. Years of resentment collapsed in a single gunshot. Ruth stood before her captain later that week, holding the final report. Charleston's courthouse stood like an old relic of Southern power. Columns, red bricks, white shutters. It looked dignified, timeless. But inside that spring, it became the center of a scandal that peeled back the polished layers of suburban perfection. The People versus Ethan Miller had begun. The former schoolteacher, the grieving widower, the man with gentle eyes and a quiet voice, now stood accused of murdering his second wife, Valerie Carter, in cold blood. As spectators filled the pews like churchgoers, hungry for gossip, Detective Ruth Delgado took her usual seat near the front, notebook in hand, pen ready. She had seen plenty of trials, but none quite like this. The media had circled like vultures the minute the arrest was made. "Boutique Queen Slain by Jealous Husband," the headlines read. "Southern Tragedy Unfolds in Quiet Suburb." The prosecution worked carefully to seat a jury untainted by press coverage. They settled on 10 women and 2 men, aged between 28 and 63. The lead prosecutor, Assistant DA Caroline Trask, was young but sharp, a courtroom firecracker with a taste for precision. Across from her sat Ethan's defense attorney, Victor Clemens, a silver-haired veteran who built his career defending rich men with bad secrets. He looked calm, but so did Ethan. Caroline Trask rose, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about control, about pride, and about a man who could not accept rejection, not from his wife and not from the woman he claimed to love. You'll see evidence that Mr. Miller planned this murder. You'll hear testimony that proves he manipulated the scene. You'll learn he wore gloves to fire a gun at a woman who once trusted him completely. She stepped closer to the jury, and when he was done, he left his lover to clean up the mess. The defense painted a different picture. Ethan was emotionally shattered, caught in a moment of domestic chaos. Victor Clemens spun a tale of two women who weaponized love, driving Ethan to the brink. The murder, he said, was not premeditated. It was a tragic accident. April Simmons was first. She walked into the courtroom with shaking hands, dressed plainly, no makeup, her hair tied back in a tight bun. She avoided Ethan's gaze as she took the stand. "What did you witness the night Valerie was killed?" Trask asked. April's voice cracked. "He shot her. She said she wanted a divorce, and he just snapped." "Did he express remorse?" "Number, he just stood there. Told me to throw the gloves away. Told me no one would believe us if I told the truth." The defense didn't hold back during cross-examination. "Miss Simmons," Victor began smoothly, "you were Valerie's best friend, were you not?" "Yes." "And you betrayed her by rekindling a relationship with her husband?" April blinked. "Yes. So it's fair to say your judgment may not be reliable?" "I didn't kill her," April said, louder now. "I didn't pull the trigger." "He did," Victor smiled. "But you helped him cover it up." She looked down. "Because I was scared." The state's crime scene investigator took the stand next. The shot was fired at close range. No defensive wounds, no bruises. Victim was seated, likely unaware. The trajectory of the bullet suggests a downward angle, consistent with the shooter standing in front of her. "And the gloves found in Ms. Simmons' trash?" Trask asked. "They contained partial prints matching the defendant. Valerie's blood was also present. Can you confirm the gloves were not April Simmons' size?" "Yes, slightly larger, more consistent with Mr. Miller's hand size." Victor objected, but it didn't matter. The jury had already begun to shift uncomfortably. Ruth took the stand with practiced poise. She walked the court through the entire investigation, laying out the timeline piece by piece, painting the picture of a man slowly unraveling under the weight of impotence, betrayal, and emotional dependence. Mr. Miller's medical history revealed a pattern of failed treatments, which created a documented strain in his marriage. Valerie's private messages indicated she planned to leave him. When she finally said the words, he reacted violently. "Did you find any sign of forced entry?" Number, Valerie let the killer in. "Why did you suspect Ethan over April?" April's confession didn't match the physical evidence. The angle of the shot, the gloves, the timing of the calls, everything pointed to Mr. Miller. Victor Clemens stood for the cross. "Detective, isn't it true you based much of your conclusion on the word of a woman who admits she burned evidence?" "I based my conclusion," Ruth said calmly, "on physical proof. Fingerprints, blood spatter, the timeline. April helped hide the truth, but Ethan created it." In a rare move, the defense called Ethan himself to the stand. The courtroom held its breath. He looked fragile but well-rehearsed. "I loved my wife," he said, "but she hated me. She made me feel like I wasn't a man. She cut me down with words every day. When I found comfort in April, I never meant for it to hurt Valerie." "Did you shoot her?" Victor asked. Ethan lowered his head. Number, she grabbed the gun. "We fought. It went off." Caroline Trask stood. "Mr. Miller, your prints were found on gloves. Gloves April says you made her dispose of." "I was panicking. I touched them earlier that day." "Earlier? Or right before you killed your wife?" He didn't answer. Trask was brutal in her final address. "This was no accident. Ethan Miller wanted control, and when that slipped away, he reached for the only power he had left, a gun." Victor's final plea was quieter. "This was a man drowning in shame and rejection. Maybe he made a mistake. But does that mistake make him a murderer?" Day 7. Verdict. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. They returned solemnly, eyes low. The foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Miller, guilty of second-degree murder. Gasps rippled through the room. April wept quietly in the back. Ethan stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Ruth felt no satisfaction, only relief. Another mask had been torn off. Another monster, dressed as a man in pain, revealed. Sentencing was set for 30 days later. Ethan faced 30 years to life, but for Ruth, the case was already closed. In Charleston, the roses bloomed again, and for now, the quiet returned. But Ruth knew better than anyone. Darkness always waits in the roots. A month after the guilty verdict, Charleston buzzed with a mix of anticipation and closure. The case of Ethan Miller had become local legend, a suburban tragedy spun from heartbreak, betrayal, and buried rage. The boutique Valerie once ran remained closed, its doors still covered in faded roses. People walked past with quiet reverence, some still unable to believe the man once known as the gentle English teacher had become a murderer. Detective Ruth Delgado didn't care about public memory. She cared about justice. Today, she would witness the final act. The courtroom was smaller today, more intimate. The cameras were gone. The jury seats were empty. This wasn't about performance anymore. This was about consequence. Ethan Miller was led in wearing the standard orange jumpsuit shackled at the wrists and ankles. His face was gaunt, his once neat beard grown patchy. He looked like a man finally forced to live inside his guilt. Judge Horace Redden, a heavy-set man with a slow, deliberate tone, reviewed the file for a full minute before looking up. This court has reviewed all submitted materials, including pre-sentencing reports, victim impact statements, and psychiatric evaluations. Before I pass sentence, I will allow the family and interested parties to speak. Valerie had no family in Charleston, but her assistant, Lacey Devereaux, rose from the back row, eyes burning. "She was my mentor," Lacey said, voice cracking. "She taught me everything about fashion, about business, about being strong. And she looked at Ethan with contempt. He destroyed her because he couldn't stand the idea of her walking away from him. That wasn't love. That was weakness and control." April Simmons sat silently beside Ruth, clutching a tissue in her lap. She had chosen not to speak, but Ruth could tell she wanted to. The judge turned to the defense table. "Mr. Clemens, does your client wish to make a statement?" Victor stood, gestured to Ethan. Ethan rose slowly. "I never meant for her to die," he said softly. "I lost control. I failed as a man, as a husband. I know that now. But I love Valerie. I truly did. I only wish I had walked away when I still had the chance." No apology, no direct acknowledgement, just remorse, vague and heavy, delivered too late. The judge nodded. "Mr. Miller, your actions were deliberate. You did not act in defense nor in blind panic. You were given chances to come forward, to tell the truth, to show integrity. Instead, you chose deception, manipulation, and murder. The court finds no mitigating circumstances worthy of leniency." A pause. "Ethan Miller, you are hereby sentenced to 38 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for the first 22 years. The gavel cracked against the desk. The room sat in silence. Ethan lowered his head. Outside, the courthouse reporters had returned, waiting for sound bites. Ruth brushed past them, flanked by officers. April caught up to her on the sidewalk. "Is that it?" April asked. "It's over now." Ruth nodded slowly. "For him, yes. For you, that depends." April looked out toward the trees lining the street. "I still loved her, you know, even after everything. She was like my other half." "You lost her twice," Ruth said. "That leaves scars." April's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "Do they ever go away?" Ruth shook her head. But you learn to live around them." 4 years passed. Time had a way of softening headlines, fading memories, and dulling the edges of tragedy. But for those who had lived inside it, those who bore the scars, it didn't move so gently. Charleston had moved on, mostly. Valerie Carter's boutique was bought, repainted, and reopened under a new name, Wild Magnolia. The store was modern now, sleek, stripped of the warmth Valerie had once poured into every corner. To most, it was just another trendy storefront. To April Simmons, it was a wound that never quite closed. April lived quietly on the edge of town now, managing a small greenhouse and nursery. She avoided crowds. She changed her hair. She told people she used to do fashion, but left it behind. No one asked why. She liked it that way. Except today, something stirred. An envelope had arrived, unmarked, hand-delivered, slid beneath her shop's back door. There was no return address, no postage. Just a plain white envelope with her name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed. "He's speaking." No name, no explanation. Just two words. April's heart stuttered. She hadn't thought of Ethan Miller in months, maybe years. The last she'd heard, he was serving time in Green Correctional. Low-risk wing, mostly teachers, white-collar guys, and one convicted murderer with an overdeveloped sense of entitlement. She called Ruth Delgado that afternoon. Charleston PD, Homicide Division. Ruth looked older, grayer at the temples, slower in her stride, but sharper than ever. When April walked into her office, Ruth didn't stand. She just raised an eyebrow. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. April handed her the note. Ruth read it, once, then again. "When did you get this?" "This morning." "You tell anyone else?" "Number just you." Ruth set the paper down, leaning back in her chair. "I haven't heard a thing about Ethan requesting any interviews or media, but I can find out." "Would he do something like that?" Ruth gave a half shrug. He always liked controlling the narrative. By the end of the day, Ruth confirmed it. Ethan Miller had recently petitioned for a recorded interview with a true crime podcast called American Obsession. The request had been approved by the prison board under free speech protections, though the podcast had not publicly announced it yet. American Obsession opened the episode with dramatic music and a somber tone. Narrator: "Today we bring you the first public words from Ethan Miller, the man convicted of murdering his wife, Valerie Carter, in 2025. What you're about to hear may change everything you thought you knew about that case." April sat in her living room, hands clenched in her lap, staring at her phone. Then Ethan's voice came through the speaker. Older now, colder, but unmistakably him. "I never meant to kill her. That's the truth. But if I'm honest, I was never the villain. I was a man betrayed. Twice. First, by a wife who hated what I couldn't give her. Then by a woman I thought still loved me. April. She was there that night, but she wasn't a witness. She was a partner." April dropped the phone. Ruth, who had been listening at the precinct, closed her eyes and muttered a curse. The podcast exploded online. Within hours, hashtag spread, hashtag free Ethan, hashtag Valerie Truth, hashtag April Knows. Amateur detectives flooded message boards. Conspiracy theorists resurrected the case like it was a Netflix special. The public's appetite for reinvented truth was insatiable. April received 3 death threats by the end of the day. Someone sent a dead rat to her greenhouse. Ruth called her that night. "Come in tomorrow," she said. "I'm reopening the file." April's voice was a whisper. "He's going to ruin me." "He's trying," Ruth said, "but I won't let him." Ruth's unofficial reinvestigation. Technically, a closed homicide couldn't be reopened without new evidence, but Ruth had learned the difference between what was official and what was necessary. She started pulling everything again. Interviews, logs, call records. She rewatched the trial footage. She replayed April's original statement. Then she looked at something she hadn't noticed the first time. A traffic cam still from the night of the murder, 8:59 p.m. It showed April driving away from the house. But someone else was in the passenger seat, barely visible through the windshield. It wasn't Ethan. Ruth zoomed in. It was Valerie's assistant, Lacey. April's face went pale when Ruth confronted her the next day. "You told me you were there alone," Ruth said, tossing the printed photo onto the desk. April stared at it. "I didn't lie. I just didn't mention everything." "Start talking." April took a breath. "After the shot, I panicked. I called Lacey. She was the only person I trusted. She helped me clean up. She told me to stay quiet. Said she'd make it all go away." Ruth froze. "She tampered with a murder scene?" April nodded. She burned the first photo. She wiped down the wine glass. She took Valerie's phone and dumped it in the river. Ruth felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The case wasn't closed. It never had been. It was supposed to be over. Ethan was in prison, Valerie was buried, and April had slipped into the quiet background of Charleston life. But now Ruth Delgado stood at the edge of a truth she hadn't seen coming. Lacey Devereaux, Valerie's loyal assistant, confidant, and so-called surrogate daughter, had been at the scene of the crime, and she hadn't said a word. Detective Delgado sat across from Lacey in a cold interview room. The young woman's fashionable blazer and glossy lipstick clashed with the stark walls and flickering fluorescent lights. "You're not under arrest," Ruth began, "but we have questions. New ones." Lacey crossed her legs, poised. "What kind of questions?" Ruth slid the traffic cam photo across the table. "This shows you in April Simmons' car the night of the murder. 8:59 p.m. That's roughly 15 minutes after Valerie was shot." Lacey stared at it, the cool expression faltering just slightly. "I was in the area. April called me. She was a mess." "You never mentioned that in your statement." "I didn't think it mattered. It does now." Ruth pressed play on the prison interview again. Ethan's voice filled the room. April didn't act alone. She had help. Someone cleaned up. Someone smart. Valerie's assistant, maybe. "Lacey." Lacey flinched. "He's lying." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "Then explain what you were doing in that house." Silence. Then, "I helped her clean up," Lacey admitted, "but only because I thought she was going to be blamed for something she didn't do." "You burned evidence." "I destroyed one photograph. That's it. And I dumped the phone because April was in shock. She was shaking so bad she could barely drive." Ruth didn't blink. "That makes you an accessory after the fact." Tears brimmed in Lacey's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "She wasn't a killer. He was. I saw the look on her face. She didn't know what had just happened." "Why didn't you come forward?" Lacey's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I didn't trust you. Or anyone." Ruth stood across from Ethan Miller, glass between them. He picked up the receiver slowly, smirking faintly like a man who thought he'd won. "I see you've heard the podcast," he said. "I've heard your lies," Ruth replied. "Not lies, just a different perspective." "You named Lacey. Why?" He shrugged. "Because it's true. April was never smart enough to cover all that on her own. Someone else was there. And you didn't mention this during trial. I was protecting people back then. Now, I don't care." "What changed?" He leaned in. "No one remembers the silent ones, detective, but they remember the storyteller." With Lacey's reluctant confession, Ruth filed a supplementary case report. Prosecutors began discussing a deal, reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation, and verification of Lacey's role in the cleanup. April's immunity stood, but her involvement in covering up Valerie's death now had clearer shape. The public didn't know yet, but when they did, the story would shatter again. Not as a triangle, but as a web of love, betrayal, fear, and silence. Valerie Carter's death was not a singular crime of passion, but a culmination of fractured identities, interpersonal decay, and unchecked emotional erosion. Ethan Miller, emasculated and embittered, pulled the trigger. April Simmons, caught between guilt and loyalty, protected him. And Lacey Devereaux, blinded by her devotion to both women, erased the evidence. Everyone lost someone, even the murderer. 1 year later, April never returned to the boutique world. She sold her greenhouse and moved north, to Asheville, where no one knew her name. Lacey accepted a plea deal, 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a public statement of accountability. She became a grief counselor, quietly helping women escape the very kind of emotional trap she once enabled. Ethan Miller remained in Green Correctional. His podcast moment faded, his fan base eroded. His voice was now just one of many echoing from behind bars, desperate to rewrite a story no longer theirs to control. And Detective Ruth Delgado, she took early retirement, moved into a cabin outside Bluffton. But sometimes, on late nights, she'd pour a glass of whiskey and pull out the file, H2753. Valerie's smile on the cover. A woman who loved deeply, maybe too deeply. She'd read it one more time, and whisper to the night. No one ever really gets away. They just last a little longer in the dark.